Lena was no stranger to hard work. Over the years, she had built her life from the ground up. As a successful businesswoman, she had faced many challenges, but she had always pushed through. Today, however, felt special. She had just made one of the biggest purchases of her life, a brand new luxury car. The car gleamed under the sunlight, its sleek design drawing eyes from everyone who passed by. The deep, glossy black paint sparkled, and the wheels shone as if they were brand new, fresh from the showroom floor. It wasn't just any car. It was a symbol of her hard work, a token of all the sacrifices she had made to get to this point in her life. Lena couldn't help but smile as she admired it for a moment. She had worked so long and hard to get here, balancing long hours at her career with family and personal life. She had earned every bit of success, and this car was her reward. She was proud of herself and felt confident. Driving it felt like the culmination of years of dedication and effort. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the freedom it represented. Lena had always been determined to prove herself, not just to others, but to herself. She didn't need to answer to anyone. She had earned her place, and now she was enjoying the fruits of her labor. On this particular morning, Lena decided to take her new car for a spin. She had a few errands to run, but she wasn't in a rush. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, and the streets were calm. She parked the car outside a small coffee shop that she visited often. She loved the peaceful atmosphere there, and it was a perfect place to relax and enjoy a cup of coffee after her errands. As she got out of the car, she took a moment to look around. The area was busy with people going about their daily activities, but Lena felt a sense of calm. She locked her car, checked her phone for any messages, and made her way inside the coffee shop. Unbeknownst to Lena, someone else had noticed her car, the officer who had just pulled into the parking lot. He was in his patrol car, glancing around as he took a slow drive through the area. When he saw Lena's luxury car parked outside the coffee shop, something about it caught his eye. He couldn't help but stare. For some reason, he felt suspicious. His mind raced with thoughts, and he quickly assumed that the car couldn't possibly belong to a black woman like Lena. It didn't fit the image he had in his head of who should own such a car. Without giving it a second thought, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Lena, meanwhile, was inside the coffee shop, enjoying her quiet moment. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no reason to believe that anything could go wrong, and she certainly didn't expect what was coming next. The officer, still sitting in his patrol car, watched her through the window, and a plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, and he was determined to do something about it. But what he didn't know was that Lena was not the type of person who would let something like this slide, and she wasn't going to back down. Lena was sitting comfortably at a corner table in the coffee shop, sipping her drink and scrolling through her phone. The soft hum of conversations around her and the quiet clink of cups were the perfect background to her peaceful moment. She loved coming here. It was her little escape from the busy world. However, as Lena took another sip of her coffee, something strange was happening just outside. The officer in the patrol car had made a decision. He had been watching her and the luxury car for several minutes, growing more suspicious by the second. He couldn't understand how a black woman like Lena could own such an expensive car. It was his assumption that there had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. He felt an urge to investigate, to challenge her. Without thinking it through, the officer got out of his car and walked toward Lena's luxury vehicle. His approach was slow but determined. He didn't even stop to think about how strange his actions might seem. He was certain that something wasn't right, and he was going to fix it. Lena was still inside, unaware of what was going on outside. She had just checked her phone again, replying to a message from a friend, when the door to the coffee shop opened. She looked up, expecting to see the barista with her coffee refill. Instead, she was surprised to see the officer walking toward her. "Excuse me," the officer said in a stern voice, standing in front of her table. "I need to speak with you about your car outside." Lena blinked in confusion. My car. Is something wrong? The officer's expression was serious, and he gestured vaguely behind him, his eyes flicking toward the door. I need to see your identification. There's a problem with your vehicle. Lena's confusion turned into surprise. What do you mean? There's nothing wrong with my car. It's mine, and I just parked it here. The officer didn't seem to be listening. He continued with his calm but authoritative tone. I'm going to need to check your ID. It's routine procedure. There's no need for you to be upset. Lena felt her pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. Why was he questioning her over something so simple? She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but there was a tone to his voice that made her uneasy. Taking a deep breath, Lena stood up, her mind racing. She had heard stories about racial profiling and unfair treatment, but she had never thought it would happen to her, especially not today, when she was simply enjoying her new car and her coffee. I'm not giving you my ID, she replied firmly. There's no reason for you to check it. This is my car, and I parked it here legally. The officer's expression didn't change. He seemed unfazed by her response. You're not listening. I'm going to have to report this, and you'll have to explain yourself to my sergeant. Lena could feel her heart beating faster now. She knew she had to remain calm, but the injustice of the situation was clear to her. She glanced at the officer, then back at the door, knowing he had no right to be doing this. What's your badge number? She asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. I want to speak to someone else. The officer hesitated, looking at her with narrowed eyes. He was clearly getting frustrated. You don't need to speak to anyone else. Just come with me. Lena stood her ground, her decision made. She was not going to let this officer get away with his unfair treatment. She wasn't about to let him get away with assuming things about her based on the color of her skin. Just as Lena took another step toward the door, the officer moved quickly, reaching for her keys and pulling them from her bag without warning. This is going to be dealt with, he said firmly, turning to leave with the keys in his hand. Lena watched in shock, her mind racing. What was going on? Why was he taking her keys? But before she could act, the officer was already headed back toward her car, leaving her standing alone in the coffee shop, feeling powerless. Lena stood in the coffee shop, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The officer had taken her keys without asking, without explanation. It felt like a bad dream. She couldn't just let him drive off with her car, a car she had worked so hard to get. She quickly rushed to the door, her thoughts racing. She had to catch him before it was too late. As she stepped outside, she saw the officer walking confidently towards her car, the keys dangling from his hand. Wait. Lena called, her voice firm but shaking. Give me my keys back. You can't just take them. The officer didn't look back. He kept walking, as if Lena's words had no power over him. He reached her car and got into the driver's seat, starting the engine. It roared to life, and Lena's stomach twisted in fear. This wasn't happening. Not today. Lena's mind was working fast. She had to act quickly. There was no way she was going to let this officer drive away with what was rightfully hers. She pulled out her phone and, in a moment of clarity, opened the car's tracking app. She had set up a GPS tracker when she bought the car, just in case, and now, in this moment, it was the only thing that could help her. As the officer began to pull away, Lena quickly tapped the screen, checking the tracker's real-time location. She saw the car's dot on the map, moving in the direction of a nearby parking lot. Lena wasn't going to let him get far. Without wasting another second, Lena dashed to her own car, started it, and followed the officer from a distance. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every minute that passed felt like an hour, but she had to stay focused. She had no idea what the officer's intentions were, but she wasn't about to let him get away with this. As she followed him, Lena kept her eyes on the road and on the map, making sure the officer's movements were tracked. It didn't take long for him to pull into a small convenience store parking lot, a place Lena knew well. She had passed it many times, but now it felt like the scene of an injustice. The officer parked the car and got out, clearly unaware that Lena was just a few cars behind him. She parked at the far end of the lot, staying out of sight. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to make her move. Lena took a deep breath and stepped out of her car. She had to be calm and assertive. There was no turning back now. She walked toward the officer, who was standing by the side of the car, checking his phone. "Excuse me," Lena said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to speak with you." The officer looked up in surprise, his face changing from confidence to confusion. He had not expected her to find him. He quickly tried to cover up his actions, offering a nervous smile. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to act casual. Lena stood her ground. "I'm here because you took my keys and drove off with my car. That is illegal." The officer seemed taken aback. He had assumed that Lena would just give up, that she would let him do whatever he wanted. But now, seeing her standing before him, he could tell she wasn't going to back down. Her confidence was clear, and the situation was starting to shift in her favor. "I don't know what you're talking about," the officer muttered, trying to avoid her gaze. "I tracked my car," Lena said calmly, showing him the app on her phone. "And now I want my keys back. You've already broken the law by taking my car without permission. I'm calling your sergeant." The officer's face went pale as the realization hit him. He knew he was in trouble now. The officer stood frozen, his eyes locked on Lena as she showed him the tracking app on her phone. For a moment, there was a heavy silence. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Lena wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let this mistake slide. And now, the officer knew he was caught. Lena's mind was clear. She knew she had every right to be upset. What the officer had done was wrong, and he had no excuse for it. But even as anger swirled inside her, she stayed calm. She couldn't let herself be rattled. The officer had to understand the gravity of his actions, and she had to make sure that he did. "You took my keys," Lena repeated, her voice firm. "You didn't even ask if it was my car. You just assumed. And now I want my keys back." The officer seemed to hesitate, looking down at the ground for a moment. His usual confidence was slipping. He had thought that this was just a minor issue, something he could quickly sweep under the rug. But now he was beginning to realize that this wasn't something that could be ignored. He had crossed a line, and there was no easy way out. "I'm sorry," the officer said, finally lifting his eyes to meet Lena's. His tone was quieter now, less sure of himself. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Lena wasn't buying it. "You didn't mean to cause trouble," she repeated, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. "You took my car without permission. How is that not causing trouble?" The officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He was starting to panic. He had acted without thinking, and now he was in a position where he couldn't undo his mistake. He knew that Lena wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. She had every right to be angry, and he knew it. I thought." The officer trailed off, searching for an explanation. "I thought you didn't belong in that car. I thought it was too expensive for you." Lena's eyes narrowed. "Too expensive for me," she repeated, her voice steady but sharp. "What does that even mean? Just because I'm black, you assumed I couldn't afford it?" The officer flinched at her words, clearly uncomfortable. He had expected her to back down or get scared, but Lena wasn't backing down. She was standing strong, and it was clear that his assumptions about her were wrong. "I'm sorry," the officer said again, though his apology sounded weak. "I should have asked you. I shouldn't have just taken your car." Lena crossed her arms, still watching him closely. She wasn't ready to accept his apology just yet. "You're right," she said. "You shouldn't have just taken my car. You should have treated me with respect from the start." The officer nodded slowly, his eyes cast down. He knew she was right, and there was nothing he could say to change that. He had messed up, and now he was facing the consequences. It was clear that Lena wasn't going to let this go, and he couldn't blame her. Lena's phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced at the screen. Her lawyer had texted her, asking for an update. She smiled, feeling a sense of reassurance. She wasn't alone in this. She had people who had her back, and she was going to make sure this officer was held accountable. "Look," the officer said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I'll give you your keys back. I'll fix this, I promise." Lena didn't say anything right away. She just stared at him for a long moment, taking in the officer's nervous expression. She wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but at least he was starting to realize the mistake he had made. "Give me the keys," she said finally, her tone steady. "And don't ever treat me like that again." The officer nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out the keys and handing them over to her. His face was pale, and his hand shook slightly as he passed them to Lena. Lena took the keys without a word and turned to leave. The situation was far from over, but at least she had her car back. She felt a sense of pride. She had stood up for herself, and the officer had learned a hard lesson. Lena stood there for a moment, holding the keys in her hand, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The officer had given them back, but she wasn't ready to let the situation go just yet. She knew that what had happened wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was bigger than that. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about her, and it wasn't the first time she'd had to stand up for herself. But even though the officer had returned the keys, she felt a nagging feeling that she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. She had to make sure that he understood just how serious his actions were. Lena didn't want to let the officer off too easily. She wasn't sure what he planned to do next, but she knew that she needed to keep an eye on him. She couldn't just walk away and pretend nothing had happened. If she let this go without further action, he might think he could do the same thing to someone else. With her mindset, Lena quickly slid into the driver's seat of her car and started the engine. She wasn't going to let the officer get away without realizing the full extent of his mistake. She would follow him, just to be sure. The officer was still standing by his patrol car, seemingly unsure of what to do next. He was clearly rattled, still trying to process the situation. His mistake had cost him more than he expected, and he wasn't sure if Lena was done with him yet. As Lena pulled out of the parking lot, she kept a safe distance behind the officer's car. She didn't want him to realize she was following him, but she needed to make sure he didn't do anything else wrong. The thought of what could happen if the officer wasn't held accountable weighed heavily on her mind. She had seen too many stories of people being wrongfully treated and not getting the justice they deserved. The officer drove slowly, as if he was trying to figure out his next move. Lena continued to follow him, her grip tight on the steering wheel. She didn't know exactly what she was hoping for. Perhaps the officer would go back to the station and report what had happened, or maybe he would make a better decision and apologize sincerely. Either way, Lena knew that she couldn't just let this moment slip by without making sure the officer understood that his actions had consequences. After a few minutes of driving, the officer pulled into a nearby convenience store parking lot. Lena stopped at the entrance, her car hidden behind a row of parked vehicles. She had a clear view of the officer's car, but she stayed out of sight. The officer got out of his car and walked toward the store. Lena could see that he was still uneasy, his hands in his pockets, as if he was trying to calm his nerves. This was it. Lena had a choice to make. She could drive away, let it go, and move on with her day. But something inside her told her that wasn't the right choice. She had worked too hard to let someone's careless actions go unnoticed. This was her moment to make sure the officer understood that what he had done was wrong, and that it wouldn't be tolerated. Lena took a deep breath and parked her car a little further away, out of sight. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she wasn't backing down. She knew that she had the power to make a difference, even in this small way. It was time to take the next step. As she sat in her car, watching the officer inside the store, Lena couldn't help but think about everything that had brought her to this point. She had come so far, overcome so many obstacles, and she wasn't going to let this be another example of people underestimating her. The officer was about to learn a valuable lesson, and so was she. Lena sat quietly in her car, watching the officer through the window of the convenience store. The minutes ticked by slowly as she waited, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She knew she had to be careful. She didn't want to make any rash decisions, but she also knew that she couldn't let this situation slip away without being fully addressed. She kept her eyes on the officer, who was pacing back and forth inside the store. It was clear he was agitated. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous energy. He kept checking his phone, looking around the store, as if trying to avoid the inevitable. Lena took a deep breath and opened the car door. She wasn't sure how this confrontation would go, but she knew she had to be firm and clear. She wasn't going to let him think he could just walk away from what had happened. He needed to understand that his actions had consequences. She closed the door quietly, making sure not to draw attention to herself. She took a few steps toward the store, her feet moving slowly but purposefully. As she approached, she could see the officer standing by the counter, his back to the door. He seemed to be lost in thought, maybe trying to come up with an excuse, maybe just unsure of what to do next. Lena walked up to him, her steps confident. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." The officer turned quickly, his eyes widening in surprise. He wasn't expecting her to confront him like this, especially after everything that had already happened. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. But Lena was already standing there, looking him in the eyes, waiting for him to acknowledge her. "I told you earlier that you took my car without permission," Lena continued, her voice calm but firm. "Now I need you to understand how serious this is." The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. He looked down at the floor, avoiding her gaze. I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said, his voice quieter now. Lena didn't let him off the hook. "It doesn't matter whether you meant it or not. You took my car. You assumed that I didn't belong in that car, and you didn't even ask. You didn't give me a chance to explain. You just took my keys and drove off like I wasn't even there." The officer was silent for a moment, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had no excuse. He couldn't justify what he had done, no matter how much he wanted to. Lena wasn't letting him off easily, and he knew it. I thought it was suspicious," he mumbled, not looking her in the eye. "I didn't think someone like you would have that kind of car." Lena felt a sharp sting at his words, but she refused to show any emotion. "Someone like me," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What does that even mean? Just because I'm a black woman, you assumed I couldn't afford it. You thought I didn't deserve it." The officer's face went pale, and he looked like he wanted to disappear. He hadn't meant to be racist, but it was clear now that his assumptions had been based on stereotypes. He had acted without thinking, and now he had to face the consequences. I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have done that." Lena nodded, her expression serious. "Sorry isn't enough," she said. "You need to understand that actions like yours have real consequences, and people like you don't get to decide who does or doesn't belong in certain places or have certain things." The officer swallowed hard, clearly shaken by her words. He knew he had messed up, and now he was facing the reality of it. He had underestimated her, and now it was clear that she wasn't going to back down. "I'll report this," Lena said, her tone softening slightly. "You need to be held accountable, and I'm going to make sure it happens." The officer nodded, looking defeated. "I understand," he said quietly. Lena gave him one last look before turning to leave. She knew that this wasn't the end of the story, but it was a step in the right direction. She had made her point, and she had stood up for herself. That was what mattered. As she walked out of the store, Lena felt a sense of pride. She had faced down an officer who had tried to take advantage of her, and she hadn't let him. She had stood her ground, and that's all she could do. It wasn't just about getting her car back. It was about making sure that no one else would ever have to face the same treatment. Lena walked out of the convenience store with a feeling of accomplishment, but she didn't let her guard down. She had stood up for herself, made her point, and confronted the officer, but that didn't mean the situation was completely resolved. She had taken a step, but there were still consequences to consider, both for her and for the officer. As she got into her car, Lena looked back at the store. The officer was still inside, standing near the counter, talking to the store clerk. He looked uneasy, his shoulders slumped, clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. Lena could see that his confidence was gone. She couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He had underestimated her, and now he was beginning to see that she wasn't someone to mess with. Lena turned the key in the ignition and started her car. The engine hummed to life, and she pulled out of the parking lot slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She had taken control of the situation, but there were still things to consider. She knew that she had to follow through on her decision to make sure the officer was held accountable. It wasn't just about the car or the keys. It was about making sure that what had happened didn't go unnoticed. As Lena drove, she made a call to her lawyer. She had already texted him earlier to update him on the situation, but now she needed to talk to him directly. It was time to take the next step. The phone rang a few times before her lawyer answered. "Lena," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "How did everything go?" Lena explained what had happened, how the officer had taken her keys and driven off with her car, and how she had tracked him down. She told him about the confrontation at the convenience store, how she had stood up to him, and demanded that he understand the seriousness of his actions. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She wanted her lawyer to know the full story. Her lawyer listened carefully, pausing for a moment before responding. "Good for you, Lena," he said. "You did the right thing. But now we need to make sure the officer is held accountable. We can't just let this go." Lena nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. I won't. I'm going to make sure he understands that his actions have consequences." They discussed the next steps, including contacting the police department and filing a formal complaint. Lena felt a sense of reassurance knowing that her lawyer had her back. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready to fight for what was right. She wasn't going to let the officer's mistake be swept under the rug. As the conversation ended, Lena hung up the phone and drove toward home. She could feel the weight of the situation settling in. She had done the right thing, but now she had to make sure it was taken seriously. The officer had made a mistake, and it wasn't something that could just be ignored. He had crossed a line, and it was time for him to face the consequences. When Lena finally pulled into her driveway, she took a deep breath. She had done everything she could for the day. Now, it was up to the system to do its part. She knew it wasn't over yet, but she was confident that she had taken the right steps. As she walked inside her house, Lena reflected on everything that had happened. She had faced a difficult situation, but she had stood her ground. She had made her voice heard, and she knew that it was important. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, and everyone who had ever been underestimated. The journey wasn't over, but Lena felt stronger than ever. She wasn't going to back down. She would continue to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The next morning, Lena woke up with a sense of purpose. She knew that the previous day had been just the beginning of what could be a long road ahead. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had already made up her mind. She was going to make sure that the officer who had wronged her would face the consequences. After a quick breakfast, Lena made a few more calls, one of which was to her lawyer, who had already started working on the legal side of things. The complaint was officially filed, and now it was time to wait for the next steps. But Lena didn't want to wait. She knew how important it was for the officer to understand the impact of his actions, not just for her, but for others too. This wasn't just about getting an apology. It was about making sure that something like this never happened again. A few hours later, Lena received an unexpected call. It was from the police department. "Hello, Miss Harris," the voice on the other end asked. "This is Officer Daniels from the police department. I'm calling to discuss the situation that occurred yesterday." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected them to call so soon. She had prepared herself for a long, drawn-out process, but this felt different. Maybe they were taking her complaint seriously after all. "Yes, this is Lena Harris," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I'd like to know what's going to be done about the officer who took my car without permission." The officer on the other end paused for a moment before responding. "We've looked into the situation, and after speaking with the officer involved, we understand that there was a serious mistake. He has been reassigned while we conduct a full review of the incident." Lena felt a sense of relief wash over her. At least the police were taking her complaint seriously, but she knew this wasn't over yet. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice firm. "Is that enough?" There was a pause, and then Officer Daniels spoke again, his voice more serious. "No, Ms. Harris, it's not over. We take situations like this very seriously, and we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The officer will be undergoing additional training, and we are also going to make sure that a public apology is issued." Lena felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. This was a step in the right direction. The officer was being held accountable, and the public apology meant that others would know what had happened and that the police were acknowledging their mistake. It wasn't the end, but it was progress. "I appreciate that," Lena said, her voice steady but with a note of gratitude. "But I still want to make sure that things change. This can't just be swept under the rug." "We understand," Officer Daniels replied. "This is only the beginning, and we are committed to making things right. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." As Lena hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of emotions: relief, pride, but also determination. The situation wasn't fully resolved, but she had made a difference. She had stood up for herself and for what was right. And now she knew that her actions would have an impact beyond just this one incident. As the day passed, Lena reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the officer, about how he had assumed she didn't belong in that car, and how he had acted without thinking. But she also thought about her own strength, how she had stood her ground, how she had refused to back down. It wasn't just about the apology or the legal actions. It was about making sure that others didn't have to face the same treatment. It was about speaking up when something wasn't right, and that was what mattered most. The journey wasn't over, but Lena was ready for whatever came next. She had made her voice heard, and she wasn't going to stop now. The road ahead might be long, but she knew she could handle it. A week had passed since the incident with the officer, and Lena felt a sense of calm settling over her. Things had been moving quickly since the police department had gotten involved. She had received an official apology from the officer who had wrongly taken her car, and the department had assured her that steps were being taken to prevent anything like this from happening again. But even though the situation had been addressed, Lena knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about making sure others were treated with fairness and respect. The public apology had been made, and the officer had been reassigned while undergoing additional training. The department had made it clear that they were committed to improving their practices, and Lena was glad to see some progress. But she didn't want to stop there. She knew that systemic changes were needed to ensure that no one else had to face the same treatment she had. Lena decided to take her experience one step further. She wanted to use her story to help raise awareness about racial profiling and the importance of treating people with dignity and respect, no matter their background. She began to reach out to local organizations that worked on issues related to racial justice, offering to share her story and help spread the message of accountability. One afternoon, Lena received a call from a local community group that was interested in having her speak at an upcoming event. The group focused on educating the public about racial inequality and promoting positive change in the community. They had heard about her experience and felt that her story could help others who had faced similar challenges. Lena agreed to speak at the event, knowing that it was an opportunity to make a bigger impact. She had always believed in the power of sharing stories, in the hope that others would learn from her experiences and feel inspired to stand up for what was right. As she prepared for the event, she thought back to everything she had been through: the frustration, the anger, and the eventual sense of justice. It wasn't an easy journey, but it had made her stronger. The day of the event arrived, and Lena stood in front of a room filled with people who were eager to hear her story. She spoke with confidence, sharing her experience with the officer and how she had fought to make sure he understood the gravity of his actions. She told the crowd about how, even in the face of unfair treatment, she had chosen to stand up for herself and for others who might be treated the same way. As Lena spoke, she could see the impact of her words on the audience. Some people nodded in agreement, others seemed deep in thought, and a few even wiped away tears. She realized that, in sharing her story, she was not only standing up for herself, but also for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or underestimated. It was about creating change, not just for her, but for everyone who deserved to be treated with respect. After the event, Lena felt a sense of fulfillment. She had taken something painful and turned it into an opportunity for growth and change. The officer had learned a lesson, the community had gained a deeper understanding, and Lena had found her voice in a way she never expected. She knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. There would always be challenges ahead, but now she felt even more prepared to face them. Lena had learned that standing up for yourself wasn't just about getting justice in one situation. It was about creating a ripple effect that could change lives. As she walked out of the event, Lena felt a deep sense of peace. She had made a difference, and she had done it with strength and grace. The road ahead would not always be easy, but Lena was ready to keep walking, knowing that with every step, she was helping to create a world where everyone could be treated fairly and with respect.